I remember the moment return stopped being an idea and became a contract. Not a vision, not a vow made in the heat of insight, a literal signature. Ink drying while my hands still trembled. I could feel the part of me that wanted loopholes. 1 foot in the world, 1 foot in the myth. Searching for a way to stay special without being accountable. But the page did not care about my feelings. A contract is the opposite of charisma. It is consequence written down. And because I had already come through arrests, institutional pressure, prison, legal rooms that did not care about my inner symbolism, this page carried that whole modern underworld weight with it. The court and the justice system had already shown themselves as a kind of ritual theatre, formal, impersonal, shadowed by power, uninterested in my preferred self-description. In my mind, the mythic mirror that rose up was Aztec sacrifice cosmology. The brutal clarity of offering something real so the world keeps turning. Not as theatre, not as blood romance, as an insistence. If you want light, something must be given. In their story, the sun doesn't move because people understand it. It moves because offerings are made. Psychology might call this a shift from disassociation into responsibility. When we're inflated, we bargain with reality. We want meaning without cost, but the nervous system can't be talked into safety. It needs structural safety. Sleep that actually happens, meals that actually land, movement that actually steadies the blood and nervous system, and it needs a law, external limits that keep inner storms from becoming public damage. So I signed, and then I did the unglamorous thing. I treated that signature like the start of a routine, not a climax of a story. I checked what time I would go to bed. I planned the next morning like I was rebuilding a damaged bridge. I told myself quietly, meaning never cancels consequence. The return is not a feeling. The return is a practice. I remember noticing my breath getting shallow, then forcing it down into my belly. I looked at the line where my name sat and felt both grief and relief. Grief for the fantasies I was letting go of. Relief that there was finally a fence around the forest fire. The next phase wasn't mystical. It was repetitive. Wake, train, work, eat, sleep, over and over until my body stopped flinching at ordinary, boring time. At first, I hated how small and insignificant it felt. Part of me wanted the explosions and fireworks back, the big metaphysical explanations. But the alarm went off anyway. I began to trust the boring sequence more than any sudden hidden, explosive revelation. The mythic mirror here was simple too. Chop wood, carry water. I used to hear that phrase as a slogan. Now it sounded like a survival manual. A reminder that the sacred spiral doesn't float above biology. It runs through the very heart of it. The wood is your nervous system. The water is your sleep depth. Ignore them and the whole journey just turns into another liability. In hindsight, psychology might call this habit architecture, building predictable cues so the brain stops scanning for threat. When the mind has been running hot, it will try to convert every sensation into a sign. Routine interrupts that completely. It gives the inner narrator less fuel. It turns attention back into something you can steer. So I built my days like a containment vessel. I regulated light and darkness. I protected sleep like it was a legal obligation. I trained not to look impressive, but to feel my body from the inside out. And I kept asking, what would keep me safe to be around? That question is not poetic. It is communal. It is ethical. It is how you stop your inner intensity from becoming somebody else's emergency. This was the householder test in its plainest form. Spiritual practice rooted in everyday life, not caves and monasteries, but a return to the room. 2 bills. to meals, to mornings, and to work. Even the question of home started changing shape. Home was no longer fantasy or transcendence. It was a day that could hold me, a rhythm my body trusted, a life I could step back into without lying. The thread wasn't an idea anymore. It was the calendar. Some days the discipline was just opening the curtains and not negotiating with myself. Some days it was saying no to late nights. The ritual was consistency, not intensity. When the body steadies, the social world comes back into focus. And that's where real cost shows up. Reconnecting with people meant facing what I had avoided, the ways my intensity had landed on others. These conversations weren't dramatic. They were careful and often painful, slower than my pride wanted. I listened way more than I explained. I offered apologies without trying to convert them into some type of lesson. The mythic mirror that held me in this season was the Chinvat bridge judgement. In Zoroastrian myth, you don't argue your way across the Chinvat bridge. You don't charm the bridge. The crossing reflects the life you have lived. For the just, it widens. For the unjust, it narrows. I kept hearing that as psychological truth. Relationships are a bridge that responds to behavior, not to self-image. Psychology might call this relational repair. Accountability is a nervous system task. When you've been defended by grand meaning, you can forget that other people track impact. Repair requires tolerating shame without collapsing into it. It requires boundaries too, knowing when to step back, when to ask for support, when to keep your story inside the circle of people who consent to hold it. It also requires a new kind of speech, less performative, more witness, less explanation, and more truth. I had to let my actions begin carrying the meaning my words once tried to force. So I did practical things. I showed up on time. I didn't make promises I knew I couldn't keep. I asked what would help, and I accepted nothing as an answer. And I remembered law and consequence. If I damaged trust, there were outcomes, and I didn't get to call them persecution. I could feel my chest tighten when silence stretched after an apology, and I let it stretch. I didn't rush to fill it with theory and explanation. I let the body learn that discomfort doesn't mean danger. Sometimes the repair was simply staying present and not making it worse. There was a moment when I realized I didn't need to teach anyone anything, because earlier I'd been hungry to explain, hungry to be the one with the map. But humility doesn't arrive as a halo. It arrives as fatigue with your own speeches. I could feel the temptation to turn my recovery into an identity. And I could feel how dangerous that would be for me and for anyone who might follow my tone instead of the truth. The mythic mirror was Buddhist suffering truth, not as philosophy, as a plain admission. Life includes dukkha, and you can't bypass it by narrating it beautifully. You can't hustle your way out of consequence. You cannot chant your way past sleep deprivation. Suffering is information. It points to attachment. It points to imbalance. It points to a system that needs care. Psychology might call this ethics maturity. Moving from I have insights to I have responsibilities. It is the end of spiritual inflation, the beginning of reality testing. If I felt elevated, that wasn't proof of wisdom. If I felt called, that wasn't permission to ignore the limits. The question became, does my life demonstrate stability? So I stepped down from the urge to be a guru. I focused on living the thread. If I spoke with caveats. If I made meaning, I made it with humility. I also started seeing more clearly that real service is not private enlightenment wearing nice language. It is love expressed as action in the world. It is choosing to return and serve rather than disappearing into a superior identity. It is allowing critique of systems, of myself, of the whole way we pathologize and romanticize suffering. And I kept returning to the same sentence like a handrail. Meaning never cancels consequence. The spiral can be sacred, but it still has gravity. I watched how quickly my mind tried to turn pain into a brand. Even my language wanted to sparkle, so I practiced plain speech. I asked friends if I drifted out into performance. Humility became a community practice, not a private mood. Out of all that ordinary discipline, something new formed. I noticed I could sit with someone else's chaos without trying to harvest it for symbolism. I could offer a map without glamour. I could point to the thread and mean it. Sleep, body, law, community. Not because I was above the labyrinth, but because I'd learned what happens when you pretend you are. The mythic mirror here is the death, rebirth ritual. Something false dies, something truer begins. In the old rites, you don't ascend. You are stripped, humbled, and returned to the village with new obligations. That was the shape of it for me, a return that asked for service, not stories. Psychology might call this meaning through service. When the nervous system is regulated, when accountability is real, the mind stops hunting for extremes. Purpose becomes less about intensity and more about repetition and consistency. It becomes measurable. Do I keep my word? Do I sleep? Do I stay within the law? Do I stay in community? So I started to frame guidance like Campbell's boon, the gift brought back, not the ordeal itself. The ordeal is not the product. The product is what helps people live. If a story makes you feel special, but makes you unsafe, it is not wisdom. If an insight makes you compassionate, but also disciplined, it is much closer to truth. The wounded healer motif finally made sense there too. The wound is not authority by itself. It becomes authority only when it teaches care and honesty and restraint. That's the contract I kept renewing day by day. No romance, no escape, just a spiral walked with responsibility. Fire carried carefully, thread held tight. There's still a part of me that wants the heroic edit, the montage where everything resolves. But the real work looks like text messages returned, bills paid, training done, and bedtime honored. That's the altar now. That's the way the boon stays clean. And if there is any blessings I could one day offer the next edgewalker, it would not be to be intense. It would be to protect the thread, to name your medicine honestly, and to bring back something that helps people live.